I never thought a bridge could make someone that angry until I built one. She just appeared in my driveway one Tuesday morning. Clipboard, violation notice, rhinestone reading glasses, and smiled the way people smile when they've already decided how this ends.
The bridge has to come down, hon.
14 months. Every single weekend. I poured those footings the same week my father was in the hospital, and he died before he ever walked across it. That bridge was the last thing we built together. The only thing I have left of him. She wanted it gone in 30 days. $250 a day in fines if I didn't comply. That's $7,500 a month. She wasn't just attacking a structure. She was coming for everything that structure meant. I stood there in my work boots and said nothing. But I started digging. And what I found in those county records buried her. Have you ever had someone with just enough power decide to use all of it against you? And where are you watching from? Hit like. Subscribe if you'd like to help the channel grow.
Let me take you back to 2019, before any of this started, when the biggest problem in Garrett Winslow's life was whether the stain he'd chosen for the bridge deck was going to look more butterscotch than honey in direct afternoon sun. Garrett was 53 at the time, a semi-retired civil engineer who'd spent 26 years designing drainage infrastructure for a mid-sized firm out of Knoxville, Tennessee. He wasn't flashy. He drove a 10-year-old F250 with a cracked passenger side mirror and kept a thermos of black coffee perpetually warm on the dash. His wife, Deborah, taught 4th grade. They had 2 grown kids and 1 dog named Brisket, a basset hound with the emotional intelligence of a therapist and the energy of a throw pillow. In 2017, Garrett and Deborah bought a 5-acre property on the edge of Mill Haven Estates, a planned subdivision tucked into the wooded hill country outside Asheville, North Carolina. The lot they chose was separated from the main road by a narrow creek, Sycamore Run, locals called it, that ran fast in spring and lazy in July, and smelled like cold pennies and pine needles after a rain. Most buyers had passed on this lot precisely because of the creek. Garrett looked at it and saw the most interesting engineering project of his retirement. He drew up plans, he pulled permits, he consulted with the county. He spent 14 months building a timber frame covered bridge, 32 feet long, wide enough for a truck, with a cedar shake roof and white painted sides, and a little plaque near the entrance that read, "Built for Deborah, named for Dad, 2018. His father, Raymond, had died of a stroke 6 months before the bridge was finished. Raymond had been a carpenter. He'd drawn that napkin sketch over a plate of biscuits and gravy. Garrett had kept the napkin in a Ziploc bag in his desk drawer ever since. The bridge was, objectively, gorgeous. Neighbors stopped their cars to photograph it. The county road inspector called it the nicest private bridge I've seen in 30 years on this job. A local lifestyle blogger visited twice. Enter Rhonda Calloway. Rhonda had been president of the Mill Haven Estates HOA for 11 years, which is approximately 10 years and 11 months longer than is psychologically healthy for anyone. She was 61, recently retired from a mid-level position at an insurance company where, by all accounts, she had thrived in the particular joy of denying claims. She drove a pearl-white Cadillac SUV, wore matching velour tracksuits in seasonal colors, and referred to the HOA's governing documents, a 74-page covenants document, as simply the rules, with a capital R, the way other people refer to scripture. She had not been thrilled when Garrett and Deborah bought their lot. She'd made a quiet comment at a neighborhood welcome gathering, something about the creek properties attracting a certain type, which Deborah had heard, cataloged, and never forgotten. For 2 years, Rhonda left them alone, mostly. There was the letter about the height of Garrett's mailbox post, 3 inches too tall, allegedly. The note about Brisket's unauthorized presence on the community walking path. The passive-aggressive mention at an HOA meeting about certain properties that seemed to be running a bed and breakfast. because Deborah's sister had visited for a long weekend and parked in what Rhonda considered the wrong spot. But in February 2021, Rhonda found her opening. The HOA had, over the winter, quietly hired a new property management company, Redstone HOA Solutions, run by a guy named Dale Pritchett, who was Rhonda's former brother-in-law and who, to put it charitably, had the ethical flexibility of a yoga instructor. Together, Rhonda and Dale commissioned a community infrastructure audit, and when the audit report landed, it cited Garrett's covered bridge as a non-conforming structure in violation of the HOA's architectural guidelines, specifically a clause about covered or roofed freestanding structures requiring board pre-approval. Garrett had received no pre-approval. He had also received no request for pre-approval. He had, in fact, been never told such approval was needed. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was 3 pages long. It gave him 30 days to tear down the bridge. Deborah read it at the kitchen table, set it down very carefully, and said, "Garrett, don't let her win." Garrett looked out the window at the bridge. He could see the little plaque from where he sat. "I won't," he said. And he meant it. Garrett's first instinct, the engineer's instinct, was to read everything, all of it. The full 74-page HOA covenants document, the architectural guidelines appendix, the amendment log that nobody but the board had ever actually touched. He printed it all out, spread it across the dining room table next to a yellow legal pad and a fresh thermos of coffee, and started reading at 7 in the morning. By noon, he had 12 pages of notes. By 2 in the afternoon, he had something better, a problem. The covenant's architectural guideline clause, the one Rhonda cited, read as follows: covered or roofed freestanding structures, including but not limited to gazebos, pergolas, and carports, require written pre-approval from the Architectural Review Committee prior to construction. Garrett underlined one word: freestanding. A covered bridge, by structural and legal definition, is not freestanding. It is a load-bearing structure that connects 2 points of land across a span. It has footings anchored to both banks. It carries live load, vehicles, foot traffic, equipment. It is, by the most precise engineering definition available, a bridge. Not a gazebo, not a pergola, not a carport. A bridge. He wrote that down in block letters on his legal pad, circled it twice, and allowed himself exactly one small celebratory sip of coffee. That same afternoon, he drove to the Buncombe County Courthouse and pulled the recorded plat for Millhaven Estates. What he found was interesting, though he didn't know how interesting yet. The plat showed Sycamore Run as the legal western boundary of the subdivision. Garrett's property straddled it. The bridge connected his private lot on the west bank to the main road access on the east, and in the margin of the plat, in the kind of dry, bureaucratic language that hides enormous consequences, there was a small notation: emergency vehicle access route, east parcel, see Exhibit C. Garrett photographed it with his phone. He'd come back to Exhibit C. First, he had a letter to write. He sent his response to Rhonda and the HOA board on a Friday afternoon, timed deliberately, because Garrett knew from 2 decades of dealing with contractors and county officials that Friday afternoon responses force a full weekend of stewing. His letter was 4 paragraphs, polite, precise. It cited the exact covenant language, the definition of freestanding structure, under North Carolina General Statute Chapter 87, Contractor and Structural Definitions, and a copy of his original county-issued building permit, which had been approved by the same municipality whose jurisdiction superseded HOA enforcement on structural safety matters. The letter closed with one sentence: I respectfully request the board withdraw its demolition demand within 14 days, or I will be compelled to seek clarification through appropriate legal channels. He dropped it in the mail, certified, return receipt, and took Brisket for a walk across the bridge. The cedar shake roof made the rain sound like applause when it came. Rhonda received the letter on Monday. By Tuesday, she'd called Dale Pritchett. By Wednesday, Dale had called a lawyer, a guy named Holt Beecham, who did HOA enforcement work, and who had the kind of practice smugness that comes from spending a career telling homeowners they're wrong. Holt sent back a letter within the week. The letter was 8 pages. It cited 3 different clauses. It included a highlighted section arguing that a covered bridge fell under the spirit of the architectural guidelines, even if not the precise letter. A legal argument roughly as solid as a screen door in a hurricane, but delivered with enough confidence that it might intimidate someone who wasn't paying close attention. It also included, and this was new, a fine schedule. Effective immediately, Garrett was being fined $150 per day for maintaining a non-compliant structure. $150 per day. Garrett set the letter on the kitchen table next to his yellow legal pad. Deborah looked at the fine amount and went very quiet in the particular way she did when she was angry enough to start problem solving. Brisket, sensing tension, crawled under the table and placed his heavy head on Garrett's foot. "She just fined us," Deborah said. "She tried to," Garrett said. "Because here's what Holt Beecham's 8-page letter did not address, could not address, and may not have even known to look for. North Carolina's HOA statute, Chapter 47F of the General Statutes, contains a provision that limits the enforcement of fines when the homeowner has submitted a written dispute. Garrett's letter, sent certified mail 2 weeks prior, constituted exactly that, a written dispute, on record, with a timestamp. The fine clock, under state law, was paused. Holt Beecham had fined a man who had already legally frozen his fine exposure without realizing it. Takeaway. In most states, a written dispute to the HOA, sent certified mail before fines begin accruing, can pause or void fine enforcement. Look up your state's HOA statute before you pay a single dollar. Garrett circled the statute citation on his legal pad, added it to the pile, and started making a list of people to call. The first person on Garrett's call list was his old colleague from the firm, a man named Prescott Dunbar, Press to everyone who'd worked with him, who had retired 2 years ahead of Garrett and spent his post-career life doing exactly 2 things: fishing for smallmouth bass and serving on county planning boards because, as Press liked to say, somebody's got to keep the idiots from paving everything. Press had spent 8 years on the Buncombe County Planning and Zoning Board. He knew the county's access and egress requirements for residential subdivisions the way a preacher knows scripture, which is to say, completely, and with considerable judgment about those who violated them. Garrett drove to Press's place on a Thursday morning, the kind of cold January day where the gravel in the driveway crunches like breakfast cereal underfoot, and the air smells of wood smoke before you even see the chimney. He brought the plat photograph. He brought the Exhibit C notation. He brought his coffee. Press looked at the plat for approximately 45 seconds before he set it on the table, took off his reading glasses and said, "You understand what this is, right?" "Tell me what you think it is," Garrett said. "It's a designated emergency egress. The county required it when Millhaven Estates was platted. You can see it right here in Exhibit C, because the back section of that subdivision has no second road access. Fire, ambulance, anything coming in from the east gets blocked if the main entrance is compromised. The county required a secondary route. That route runs across Sycamore Run." Press tapped the photograph. "Across your land, across your bridge." Garrett looked at him. "Is that in the deed?" "It's in the plat, and the plat was recorded before the first house was built, which means," Press paused, "every homeowner in Millhaven Estates, including the HOA board, took title to their property with that egress route already baked into the record." The weight of that settled over the kitchen table like a warm front. Rhonda Calloway had spent 11 years as president of the HOA that governed a subdivision whose only emergency exit, the only route a fire truck could use if the main entrance was blocked, ran across the private bridge she had just ordered a man to demolish. And she had done it, apparently, without ever once reading the plat of the community she'd been queen of for over a decade. Garrett drove home, turned on his desk lamp, and pulled up the Buncombe County GIS mapping system, a public database that any citizen can access for free, which is one of those beautiful civic facts that almost no one knows. He cross-referenced the plat with the current county emergency vehicle access maps, which are filed with the fire marshal's office and also publicly available. The bridge appeared, clearly, labeled, as a secondary emergency egress for Millhaven Estates' eastern parcels. 17 homes total, including the 5 premium lots on the ridge, including Rhonda Calloway's own house. He saved the screenshots. He printed them. He put them in a manila folder labeled, with a certain quiet satisfaction, "O." Meanwhile, Rhonda was escalating. She held a special HOA board meeting. She had the power to call them, being president, and put 2 items on the agenda. First, formally increasing Garrett's daily fine to $250. Second, sending a letter to the county code enforcement office alleging that the bridge might be structurally unsound, in hopes of getting a county-level demolition order that would carry more legal weight than the HOA's. She had no evidence the bridge was unsound. It had been inspected, permitted, and approved. But Rhonda had learned, and this is perhaps her most identifiable characteristic as a type, that making a complaint costs nothing, and making someone respond to a false complaint costs them time and money. Death by paperwork. It was her move of choice. The code enforcement letter went out on a Friday. Garrett received a copy the following Tuesday, forwarded by the county inspector's office, who had called him first, professional courtesy, to let him know it was coming, and that they considered it, in the inspector's words, a pretty thin complaint. The inspector's name was Terry. Terry had visited the bridge twice for permitted inspections. He had, both times, expressed admiration for the mortise and tenon joinery on the king post trusses. "She's saying it might be unsafe," Terry told Garrett on the phone. "What do you think?" Garrett asked. "I think it's the best-built private bridge in this county," Terry said. "I'll put that in writing." He did. Garrett added it to the folder. The folder was getting thick. February became March, and Rhonda, sensing that the legal angle was moving slower than she'd hoped, pivoted to the social front, which, in a subdivision like Millhaven Estates, was arguably more dangerous than any court filing. She began working the neighborhood the way a career politician works a room, carefully, specifically, and with a story tailored to whoever was listening. To the older couples on the ridge, she implied that Garrett's bridge was creating a precedent problem. If he could build whatever he wanted, what would stop others? To the younger families near the community pool, she suggested that Garrett and Deborah were litigious types who'd tied up HOA funds with their dispute, which was going to affect pool maintenance. To the handful of homeowners who'd never paid much attention to HOA politics, she simply said Garrett was causing trouble. None of it was technically a lie. All of it was profoundly misleading. This is Rhonda's particular skill, the architecture of implication. It worked, partially. 3 households, people who'd always been cordial to Garrett and Deborah, stopped waving when they passed. One neighbor, a guy named Fitch, who'd borrowed Garrett's pressure washer twice and never returned it spotlessly, actually signed a petition Rhonda circulated, calling for consistent enforcement of community standards. The petition had 11 signatures on a subdivision with 64 households. Rhonda called it overwhelming community support. Deborah, who had a 4th-grade teacher's finely calibrated radar for social manipulation, noticed every single shift. She kept a list, not to be petty, to be prepared. What Rhonda didn't know, and what would have alarmed her considerably, was that the social campaign was also generating pushback she couldn't see. 3 of Garrett's neighbors, including an 81-year-old retired appellate court judge named Harlan Voss, who lived 2 lots south and had observed Rhonda's HOA presidency with the steady, disapproving attention of a man who'd spent decades watching people abuse procedural authority, had quietly reached out to Garrett. Harlan showed up at Garrett's door on a Saturday morning with a plate of his wife's cornbread, the smell of it cutting right through the cold air before Garrett even got the door open. "I heard what she's doing," Harlan said. He didn't mean Rhonda specifically. He meant the thing. He'd seen the thing done before. "I know what she's doing," Garrett said. "Then let me tell you what she can't do," Harlan said, settling into a kitchen chair and accepting a cup of coffee. "Pull out that plat." Harlan spent 90 minutes with Garrett at that table. What he explained, drawing on 40 years of property and administrative law, was this. The Millhaven Estates HOA, as a non-profit homeowners association organized under North Carolina statute, had a fiduciary duty to every homeowner in the subdivision, not just to enforce the rules, to protect the community's interests, including, specifically, its safety infrastructure. If an HOA board president ordered the demolition of a legally recorded emergency egress route, knowingly or unknowingly, she exposed the entire association to liability. If a fire truck ever needed that route and couldn't use it because the bridge was gone and someone died, the association's liability exposure was catastrophic. "She's not just being petty," Harlan said. "She's creating a tort." Takeaway: HOA board members have a fiduciary duty to all homeowners. Ordering the destruction of safety infrastructure, even unknowingly, can expose the entire board to personal liability. Document everything. Garrett added this to his legal pad in block letters. Fiduciary duty, safety infrastructure, personal liability. He called Press that afternoon. Press already knew about fiduciary duty. He'd served on enough boards to have been briefed on it regularly. But what Press added was the operational angle. The county fire marshal's office maintained its own records of emergency egress routes. Those records were independent of the HOA. If Garrett filed a formal inquiry with the fire marshal's office, a public records request available to any citizen, the fire marshal would be compelled to review whether the designated emergency egress for Millhaven Estates was intact and accessible. Once the fire marshal opened an inquiry, the HOA could no longer simply pretend the bridge was just some aesthetic disagreement about covered structures. It became a public safety matter. It became a matter of record. It became something that could not be quietly resolved in Rhonda's favor, without a very uncomfortable paper trail. Garrett submitted the public records request to the fire marshal's office on a Thursday. The response window was 10 business days. He waited. He worked on the bridge, reinforcing a minor section of the deck railing he'd been meaning to upgrade anyway. The sound of his drill echoed over Sycamore Run in the cold morning air. He waited. The fire marshal's office responded in 7 days, faster than expected. The response came in the form of a letter from Chief Deputy Marshal Wendell Okafor, a 22-year veteran of the County Fire Service, who wrote with the clipped precision of a man who did not enjoy ambiguity. The letter confirmed 3 things that Garrett already suspected, and 1 thing he did not. First, Sycamore Run Bridge, identified by its recorded plat designation, was formally listed in Buncombe County's Emergency Vehicle Access Registry as a secondary egress for the eastern parcels of Millhaven Estates. This listing was established in 1997 when the subdivision was originally platted. It had never been removed, amended, or superseded. Second, as a registered emergency egress, the bridge fell under county jurisdiction for access and safety purposes, jurisdiction that superseded the HOA's architectural authority. The HOA could regulate the appearance of structures on member properties. It could not order the demolition of a county-registered safety route. Those were not the same power. Third, any modification to a registered emergency egress, including demolition, required formal written approval from the county fire marshal's office, the county planning department, and the provision of an alternative egress route before the existing one could be removed. No such application had ever been filed, not by Garrett, not by the HOA. These three confirmations were satisfying. The fourth item was electric. In reviewing the file, Chief Deputy Okafor's office had discovered that the HOA, specifically the board, was already on record as having received notice of the bridge's emergency egress status. In 2018, when the subdivision underwent a routine county safety infrastructure review, the fire marshal's office had sent a formal notification to the Millhaven Estates HOA Board of Directors by certified mail, informing them of all registered emergency egress routes within the subdivision's boundaries, including the bridge across Sycamore Run. The notification had been received and signed for by Rhonda Calloway, President, Millhaven Estates HOA. Garrett read that line 3 times. He set the letter down. He picked it up and read it again. Rhonda had known. She had known in 2018, 3 years before she sent the demolition demand, that the bridge was a county-registered emergency exit. She had signed for the certified letter confirming it, and then she had sent a demolition demand anyway, fined Garrett $250 a day, filed a false structural complaint with the county, and spent months conducting a social pressure campaign against him and his wife in a neighborhood she ostensibly served as a fiduciary. This was not ignorance. This was not a procedural mistake. This was willful. Deborah, when Garrett showed her the letter, was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "She knew. The whole time. The whole time," Garrett said. Brisket, sensing something important had happened, got up from his spot by the back door, crossed the kitchen, and put his head in Deborah's lap. Harlan Voss, when Garrett called him, was also quiet. Then he said, "Garrett, you need to talk to a property rights attorney. Today, not next week. Today." Garrett called 3 attorneys that afternoon. The one he chose was a woman named Vivian Alderman, who had been practicing property and HOA law in western North Carolina for 18 years, and who, when Garrett finished explaining the situation, said, "You don't have a defense, you have a counterclaim." Vivian Alderman's office was on the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian in downtown Asheville, up a flight of stairs that creaked in a reassuring old house way, past a wall of framed case citations that weren't decorative, they were a resume. She was 54, wore dark-framed glasses and no-nonsense blazers, and had the rare gift of explaining legal strategy with the clarity of someone who genuinely wanted her client to understand what was happening, rather than feel dependent on her for interpretation. She met with Garrett and Deborah for 2 hours on a Tuesday afternoon. She had already reviewed the documents Garrett had sent over: the plat, the covenant language, the fire marshal's letter, Rhonda's demolition demand, the fine history, the false structural complaint, and the 2018 certified notification receipt bearing Rhonda's signature. When she finished her review and looked up, she said, "Here's what we're going to do." The first piece of the strategy was a cease and desist on the fines. Under North Carolina HOA law, fines assessed against a homeowner who has filed a written dispute, which Garrett had done, on record, via certified mail, are unenforceable until the dispute is formally resolved through the HOA's internal hearing process. The HOA had never scheduled a hearing. They had simply kept sending invoices. Vivian would file a formal notice that the fine accrual was void ab initio, legally invalid from the start. Any attempt to collect would constitute a violation of the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, which carries federal penalties. Takeaway: HOA fines that bypass the required internal dispute process are often uncollectible, and attempting to collect them can expose the HOA to federal debt collection violations. The second piece was the counterclaim. The false structural complaint filed with county code enforcement was documented. It was provably baseless. Terry the inspector had already put his professional assessment in writing. A baseless complaint filed with a government agency for the purpose of harassing a property owner is, in North Carolina, actionable under the state's abuse of process doctrine. It was also, potentially, actionable under the Fair Housing Act, given Rhonda's 2019 comment about creek properties and a certain type. A comment Deborah had never forgotten and had, it turned out, mentioned to two neighbors who remembered hearing it. Vivian flagged this piece carefully. It wasn't slam-dunk discrimination evidence on its own, but it was context, and context mattered in depositions. The third piece, the one that made Garrett lean forward in his chair, was the personal liability exposure. Rhonda had signed for the 2018 emergency egress notification. She had known the bridge's legal status. She had issued the demolition demand anyway. In doing so, she had exposed herself and the entire HOA board, as individuals, to liability for attempting to obstruct a county-registered safety infrastructure. Vivian intended to name Rhonda, Dale Pritchett, and the other two board members who'd co-signed the demolition demand personally, not just the HOA as an entity. Piercing the corporate veil on an HOA board required showing willful or reckless conduct. The 2018 certified receipt was exactly that evidence. "She signed for the letter," Garrett said. "She signed for the letter," Vivian confirmed. "That's your sword." While Vivian prepared the legal filings, Garrett and Press were working the county angle in parallel. Press, through his planning board contacts, facilitated an official request for a county safety inspection of all registered emergency egress routes in Millhaven Estates, a routine review that the county conducted periodically, but that had, in the case of Millhaven Estates, been flagged as overdue in the fire marshal's records. Chief Deputy Okafor was, as Press diplomatically put it, already interested in having a look around. Harlan Voss, meanwhile, was doing something quieter and more powerful, talking to his neighbors. Harlan was not a gossip. He was a former appellate judge. When he explained to the 17 households in the back section of Millhaven Estates, slowly, clearly, with the patient gravity of a man who delivered verdicts, that the bridge they'd been driving past without a second thought was the only emergency exit their homes had, and that it had nearly been demolished at the HOA president's direction, the neighborhood changed temperature noticeably. 2 of those 17 households had small children. 3 of them had elderly parents living with them. 1 family had a member with a mobility disability who relied on that route for ambulance access. These were not abstract concerns. By the end of that week, Harlan had 19 signatures on a letter, addressed to the full HOA board, to the county fire marshal's office, and to the Buncombe County Board of Commissioners, formally requesting an independent safety audit and a review of the board's conduct. Fitch, who had signed Rhonda's petition, quietly asked Harlan if he could add his name to this one instead. Harlan said yes. The letter went out on a Friday, certified mail, return receipt. Garrett allowed himself a second celebratory sip of coffee. Rhonda received the county safety inspection notice on a Wednesday morning, and the 19-signature homeowner letter the same afternoon, and Vivian Alderman's legal filing notice by Friday. And the effect of all 3 arriving in the same week was visible in ways that a subdivision's social ecosystem always makes visible. The pearl-white Cadillac stopped making its customary slow patrol loops through the neighborhood. The seasonal wreath on Rhonda's front door, a cheerful spring arrangement of faux forsythia, stayed up 2 weeks past its natural aesthetic expiration. Her presence at the community mailboxes, previously a daily ritual, became intermittent, then rare. She was regrouping, which meant, in Rhonda's playbook, she was preparing a counter-offensive. The first move came through Dale Pritchett, whose fingerprints Garrett had learned to recognize by their particular combination of legal-adjacent language and plausible deniability. Dale sent a letter to all 64 households in Millhaven Estates, on official Redstone HOA Solutions letterhead, informing homeowners that the HOA had been forced to engage legal counsel due to the litigation threats of a single homeowner, and that as a result, a special assessment might be necessary to cover legal fees. The special assessment was framed as a possibility, not a certainty. The legal fees were described as significant. The single homeowner was not named. He didn't have to be named. The letter landed in Garrett's mailbox with a particular thud. It was a clever move, in a small, mean way. It repositioned Garrett as the aggressor, turned the neighborhood's potential financial anxiety against him, and gave people who wanted to stay neutral a reason to be irritated with him, rather than curious about Rhonda. Garrett forwarded it to Vivienne immediately. Vivienne read it once, replied within the hour, and said, "This is good for us." Because Dale's letter, sent to 64 households, describing ongoing legal matters, implying financial harm caused by Garrett's dispute, constituted communication about pending litigation directed to non-parties. It also contained an implied threat, the special assessment, that, under North Carolina HOA law, required a homeowner vote to implement, could not be levied for legal fees arising from a board member's personally actionable conduct, and could not be used as a pressure tactic against a homeowner who had filed a legal dispute. Dale had, in trying to apply social pressure at scale, handed Vivienne 3 additional violations on a platter. Vivienne added them to the counterclaim. The document was getting long. Rhonda's second move was subtler and more personal. She began, through a chain of social transmission that Deborah tracked with the quiet accuracy she applied to everything, suggesting to certain neighbors that Garrett had mental health issues, that the bridge was some kind of obsession, that Deborah was enabling him, and that the family was not what they seemed. None of this was attributable. It floated through the neighborhood like smoke, sourceless, hard to clear, mildly suffocating. This was the move that made Deborah truly angry. Not fines, not legal filings, the whisper campaign about her husband's mental state. She did not yell. She did not confront Rhonda in the driveway. She went home, sat at the kitchen table, wrote down the date, what she'd heard, who she'd heard it from, and who that person said they'd heard it from. She built a chain of attribution, one careful link at a time, the way a 4th-grade teacher documents a bullying pattern, methodically, precisely, and with the understanding that the paperwork will matter later. Garrett, meanwhile, was on the phone with a journalist. He hadn't gone looking for media. The media had, in a roundabout way, come to him. A local reporter at the Asheville Citizen-Times named Bettina Shreve, who covered local government and had been alerted to the county safety inspection request by a source in the fire marshal's office. Bettina was 42 and thorough, the kind of reporter who took notes in the margins of her notes, and who called Garrett not for a quote, but to understand the timeline. Garrett spent an hour with her on the phone. He sent her documents. He introduced her to Harlan Voss, who spoke with the gravity of a man whose statements had historically carried the weight of law. Bettina did not publish immediately. She was building something. Garrett respected the patience. He understood it. You don't pour a footing until the ground is ready. The ground was almost ready. Press called Garrett on a Sunday morning, the smell of early April tulip poplars in bloom drifting through the open kitchen window, like something you can't quite name but always recognize. The fire marshal's inspection is scheduled, Press said. 2 weeks out. They're bringing the full safety compliance team. Does Rhonda know? Garrett asked. She will, Press said. It's a public notice. 2 weeks. The public notice of the fire marshal's inspection was posted, per county procedure, on the Buncombe County website and the Millhaven Estates Community Board, the physical corkboard near the mailboxes, and the online portal that most homeowners ignored until something went wrong. Garrett saw it go up at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday. By noon, he had received 11 texts from neighbors. Rhonda, he later learned from a neighbor who was present, saw it at the mailboxes and went very still in a way that the neighbor found unsettling. She stood there reading for almost a full minute. Then she walked back to her Cadillac and drove home and didn't come back out for the rest of the day. In the 2 weeks before the inspection, Rhonda and Dale Pritchett made 3 moves that Garrett and Vivienne would later categorize, not without some amusement, as the Desperation Trilogy. The first, Dale filed an emergency motion with the HOA board to table all pending disputes and fine assessments pending board review. an internal procedural dodge that had no legal force once a dispute was in litigation, but that Dale apparently hoped would create the appearance of good faith process. Vivienne noted it, replied to it, and moved on. The second, Rhonda approached 2 of the 17 back section homeowners, the ones Harlan had organized, and suggested privately that if they withdrew their names from the safety complaint letter, she would waive their HOA dues for the year. 2 homeowners reported this offer to Harlan within 24 hours. Harlan, who had spent a career watching witnesses get approached, told both of them the same thing. Write down what you were told, when, and where, sign it, and give it to him. They did. Attempted inducement to withdraw a safety complaint was a new entry in the folder. Vivian upgraded it from context to exhibit. The third, Dale sent a letter to Garrett, not to Vivian, which was itself a procedural error when represented parties are involved, offering a settlement. The HOA would drop the demolition demand, reduce all outstanding fines to 0, and issue a written apology, in exchange for Garrett agreeing not to pursue personal liability claims against individual board members, and agreeing to a confidentiality clause. Garrett called Vivienne. She read the letter. She said, "They're scared." "I know," Garrett said. "What do we do?" "We decline," Vivienne said, politely. "And we note that the offer was made directly to a represented party, which I'll be raising with the bar separately." Garrett's declining letter was 1 paragraph, polite, precise. He enjoyed writing it more than he probably should have. What he was doing during these 2 weeks, while the legal machinery ground forward, was something quieter and more physical. He was making the bridge perfect. He installed the railing upgrade he'd been planning. He replaced 2 cedar shakes on the roof that had curled slightly over winter. He refinished the small plaque by the entrance, built for Deborah, named for Dad, 2018, with a fresh coat of spar urethane, the smell of it sharp and clean in the cold morning air. He walked the deck with Terry, the county inspector, one afternoon, and Terry signed off on a voluntary re-inspection, generating a fresh structural certification dated 2 weeks before the fire marshal's visit. Deborah brought hot coffee out to the bridge on a Saturday morning and sat with Garrett on the railing, looking at Sycamore Run below them, running clear and fast with snowmelt. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Like someone who built a good bridge," Garrett said. He meant it in all the ways it could mean. Harlan finished one more quiet task in those 2 weeks. He had contacted, through his professional network, a retired North Carolina state fire marshal, a man named Cornelius Buck, who'd served for 28 years and was known in regulatory circles with the kind of quiet reverence that attaches to genuinely competent people. Cornelius was not officially involved in the county's inspection, but he had agreed, as a private citizen and as a neighbor of Harlan's acquaintance, to attend the inspection as an observer. When Rhonda's attorney, Holt Beecham, found out Cornelius Buck was going to be there, he called Holt to ask if there was any last-minute room for accommodation. There wasn't. Bettina Shreve from the Citizen Times called Garrett the night before the inspection. "I'll be there in the morning," she said, "with a photographer." "See you then," Garrett said. He slept well that night. The creek ran below the house, and the sound of it, that steady, unhurried flow over smooth stones, was the most relaxing sound he knew. The morning of the fire marshal's inspection arrived cold and bright, the kind of April day in western North Carolina, where the mountains are still half gray with winter, but the dogwoods have pushed out white blooms anyway, stubborn and lovely along every ridgeline. The inspection was scheduled for 9 a.m. By 8:45, Sycamore Run Bridge had an audience. Chief Deputy Marshal Wendell Okafor arrived first in a county vehicle, with 2 members of his compliance team. Terry from County Code Enforcement was already there. He'd come early, coffee in hand, with the easy comfort of a man who knew his inspection report was going to speak very clearly for itself. Cornelius Buck arrived in a personal vehicle and stood near the tree line with his hands in his coat pockets, watching. Bettina Shreve and her photographer set up on the east bank, angled to capture the bridge in its full 32-foot span. Harlan Voss walked down from his property with his wife, Mabel, who had brought a second plate of cornbread. He was dressed, for no explicable reason, as though for court, dark jacket, pressed slacks, which turned out to be entirely appropriate. Garrett and Deborah stood on their side of the bridge. He was wearing his old work boots, the ones with the worn heel that creaked on the left side. He'd considered dressing up. He had not dressed up. He'd built the bridge in these boots. Rhonda arrived at 9:02, with Holt Beecham beside her, both of them moving with the posture of people trying to appear composed while calculating exits. Dale Pritchett arrived 2 minutes later and stood slightly apart from Rhonda, in the way of a man beginning to consider that the ship he boarded may have been structurally unsound from the start. Chief Deputy Okafor conducted the inspection with methodical thoroughness. He walked the entire bridge deck. He examined the footings on both banks. He reviewed the structural certification Terry provided. He consulted his records, the 1997 plat, the emergency access registration, the 2018 board notification. He photographed everything. He took measurements. He made notes. The process took 51 minutes. When he was finished, he stood in the center of the bridge and addressed the assembled group with the even, unhurried voice of a man who had been doing this for 22 years. "This structure," he said, "is sound. It is properly maintained. It is legally registered as a secondary emergency egress for the eastern parcels of Millhaven Estates, 17 properties, under County Emergency Vehicle Access Designation, EV-1997-014. Its removal would require formal county approval, provision of an alternate egress route of equivalent capacity, and notification to all 17 affected property owners. None of that process has been initiated." He paused. "To be clear, this bridge cannot be ordered removed by a homeowners association. The HOA does not have that authority. They did not have it in 2021 when the demolition demand was issued. They do not have it today." He looked, for just a moment, in Rhonda's direction, not pointedly, professionally, the way you look at the source of a problem when you want it understood that you've located the source. "I'll be filing a formal compliance report with the County Board of Commissioners," Okafor continued. "Given that the board of this association was on record as having been notified of this structure's emergency access designation in 2018, the commission will likely want to review the board's conduct." Holt Beecham said something, quietly, to Rhonda. Rhonda said nothing. Bettina's photographer took the shot at exactly that moment. Garrett standing on the bridge he'd built, hands in his jacket pockets, the cedar shake roof above him and Sycamore Run below, the plaque visible just over his left shoulder. The dogwood blooms were white in the background. The mountains were behind everything. It ran on the Citizen Times front page the following Thursday. The headline was, "Bridge built in Dad's honor turns out to be HOA's only emergency exit, and the president knew it." The comment section had 847 responses by noon. The mic drop, when it came, was not loud. It came in the form of Cornelius Buck, retired state fire marshal, 28 years of service, walking over to Garrett after the county team had wrapped up, shaking his hand and saying, "Your father built good things." Garrett looked at him. He hadn't mentioned Raymond to anyone that morning. He glanced at Harlan, who gave nothing away. "He did," Garrett said. He had to look away for a moment, at the creek below. The cedar shake roof made a sound in the breeze, like applause. The legal resolution came in pieces over the following 3 months, the way these things always do, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a sequence of documents and withdrawals and settlements that accumulate into something that looks, in retrospect, like justice. Vivian Alderman's counterclaim settled before it reached trial. The HOA's insurance carrier, confronted with the 2018 certified notification receipt, the documented false structural complaint, Dale's legally defective mass letter about litigation, Rhonda's attempted inducement of the safety complaint signatories, and a mounting file of conduct that no insurer wanted to defend in open court, made an offer. The terms were confidential, as settlements typically are. What Garrett and Deborah could say publicly: all fines were zeroed, all legal fees were paid. The demolition demand was formally withdrawn and stricken from the HOA record. A written correction was issued to all 64 homeowners. Rhonda Calloway resigned from the HOA board 14 days after the fire marshal's inspection. She cited personal reasons in a one-sentence letter that arrived by email rather than certified mail. Dale Pritchett's contract with the HOA was not renewed. Holt Beecham sent Vivian a brief, notably deferential letter wrapping up the matter. The board election that followed, the first genuinely contested one in 11 years, produced 3 new members: Harlan Voss, who had been persuaded by his neighbors that his professional experience was too valuable to waste on his bass fishing schedule; a woman named Patricia Odom, who ran the neighborhood's community garden program and had been trying to get the HOA to fund a composting initiative for 4 years without success; and, unanimously elected as the new president, Deborah Winslow. Deborah had not sought the position. She had been nominated by Fitch, the same neighbor who'd signed Rhonda's petition, who had walked across the street to the Winslow's door one evening, held his hat in his hand in the literal, figurative sense, and asked Garrett if he thought Deborah might be willing to run. Garrett had looked at Deborah. Deborah had thought for approximately 4 seconds. Then she said yes. She won with 61 of 64 votes. The other 3 were, presumably, the ones who'd never removed the Rhonda for President signs from their garages. The community garden got its composting program. The long-stalled discussion about installing sidewalks on the back road, the road that ran past the creek, past Garrett's bridge, finally went to a vote and passed. The bridge itself became something else entirely in the year that followed. Garrett, with the HOA board's formal blessing and a small grant from the Buncombe County Community Heritage Fund, which Press had helped him identify and apply for, added interpretive signage to the bridge entrance. A small weatherproof panel explaining the history of covered timber frame bridges in western North Carolina. A second panel, below it, with a photograph of Raymond Winslow's original napkin sketch. Raymond Winslow, 1943 to 2018, carpenter, father, original designer. The third thing Garrett did, the thing he hadn't planned, that emerged from a conversation with Bettina Shreve over coffee after her article ran, when she mentioned that she'd heard from several readers who'd sent letters about their own fathers and the things they'd built and lost, was establish a small scholarship, the Raymond Winslow Memorial Scholarship, administered through the local community college's vocational and trades program. 1 award per year, $400, to a student pursuing training in carpentry, structural engineering, or construction management. It wasn't enormous. It was exactly the right size. Garrett and Deborah still have coffee on the bridge on Saturday mornings when the weather allows. Brisket stretched across their feet, the creek running below them. The cedar shake roof has weathered beautifully, silver at the edges where the sun has been working at it.